Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. Today we're checking out what happened to dead bodies after big battles throughout history.
Now let's get into it, because today we're answering a viewer question because Jen M asks us, what did they do with all the dead bodies after huge battles in history?
I would imagine most of the bodies get broken down and absorbed into the earth. Or maybe they burn them. Maybe they eat them.
Given we know that even Neanderthals would bury their dead, even including objects with the bodies, and various human hunter-gatherer groups likewise used to bury or cremate people at specific sites that functioned as sort of pilgrimage locations for these nomads, it should come as no surprise that since the dawn of known warfare, soldiers have pondered the question of what to do with the bodies of their fallen comrades and enemies. So, what did various groups throughout history actually do about this? A thing we should note before we continue is that there is a definite gap in the memory of history in regards to this one specific matter, and historians only have sparse reports of what happened to the dead of many groups after battles. You might think that solving this problem would simply be a matter of locating famous battle sites and doing some digging to glean a little more insight, but it turns out even this is notoriously difficult, as we're going to get into shortly.
Yeah, whenever I hear about battles in videos like this or in school, they never touch on the subject of what they do with the bodies, unless it's something particularly gruesome, like they put their head on a stake or something like that.
That caveat out of the way, on the more definitive front, it's noted that the ancient Greeks made an effort to respect the usual burial customs of the dead after a battle, and collecting the bodies of the fallen was not uncommon. For example, following the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC between Philip II of Macedonia and the Athenians, both sides buried their dead in accordance with the religious customs of the period. This was essentially done both out of respect for the valor of the dead, as well as to appease the gods.
That seems logical. That's actually really considerate, because there must have been a lot of bodies, and they still took each one and buried it and did all the rituals around it. Did the ancient Greeks put coins on people's eyes? Or is that a Roman thing? I think it's a Roman thing. I'm going to look it up. After being washed and anointed with oil, the body was dressed, placed on a high bed within the house. Relatives and friends came to pay respects. So that was very similar to what we do now, I guess, in terms of having a funeral and a wake, and then they take the body to the cemetery. Very considerate, because that probably took a lot of effort to do that for everybody and everybody.
The Spartans, who often buried fallen soldiers on the battlefield where they were killed. Also somewhat unique was that rather than stripping the dead of valuables, as per Spartan tradition, each fallen Spartan was buried with their weapons and armor, and their final resting place was marked by a simple tombstone with their name and an inscription that read, translated, "In war." This was actually a special honor among the Spartans. If one were to die outside of a battle, no such tombstone would be given, and the person would simply be buried in an unmarked grave.
Wow, so the Spartans, they buried them with their weapons, their uniforms, their shields. I mean, that's very respectful, but probably kind of a waste. Because what can they do with the swords and the shields if they're dead? But I guess it's a point of honor and tradition and respect. And they believed in those, the gods.
The same cannot be said of later wars, where there seems to have been an almost callous disregard for the fallen, and looting of the dead and dying was commonplace. For example, the Bear Tapestry depicting the Battle of Hastings in 1066 shows soldiers piling up bodies of the dead and stripping them of their valuables. It's believed that following this, bodies were quickly cremated or buried in nearby mass graves.
How many people died at the Battle of Hastings, I wonder? 2,000 invaders and 4,000 Englishmen, so 6,000 dead bodies to deal with, or to loot from. That's a lot of shoes. That's like 12,000 pairs of shoes. No, 6,000. 6,000 pairs of shoes. And swords and smocks. I don't blame them for looting the dead, especially back then. Like, you can't just go to Walmart and buy a smock.
It should be noted here, however, that with the rise of Christianity, mass cremation, at least for a time, seems to have gone the way of the dodo in some regions in favor of mass graves. That said, despite the countless battles that occurred throughout medieval Europe, archaeologists have had an extraordinarily difficult time actually finding any of the bodies. As one paper published in the Journal of Conflict Archaeology, aptly titled "Where Are the Dead of Medieval Battles?" notes, only a handful of mass graves from the late medieval battles in Western Europe have been subject to large-scale excavation to modern standards. The principal reason is that these, and indeed even early modern battlefield graves, have proven extremely elusive, most being identified by chance.
How long does it take a body to decompose in the ground? Probably gonna get the NSA on my case by searching that. How long does it take a body to decompose in the ground? Up to a decade. Okay, but the skeleton will be left. Let's change this to bones. How long does it take the bones to decompose? Skeletons normally take around 20 years to dissolve in fertile soil. However, in sand or neutral soil, skeletons can remain intact for hundreds of years. It's a big difference. So they may have just become dirt, right?
Looking at much better documented times, looting of the dead was also extraordinarily common during the extremely deadly Napoleonic Wars, with soldiers and locals alike pilfering what they could find after battles. For example, consider this account from a British general following the Battle of Heilsberg in 1807. The ground between the wood and the Russian batteries, about a quarter of a mile, was a sheet of naked human bodies, which friends and foes had, during the night, mutually stripped, although numbers of these bodies still retained consciousness of their situation. It was a sight that the eye loathed, but from which it could not remove.
That must be so disgusting. Just a field of dead bodies. The smell. Ugh.
And yes, as noted there, the severely wounded weren't spared the indignity of being robbed of their worldly possessions as they lay dying. Here's a snippet of one such quote from a French soldier called Jean-Baptiste de Marbeau. "Stretched on the snow among the piles of dead and dying, unable to move in any way, I gradually and without pain lost consciousness. I judged that my swoon lasted 4 hours, and when I came to my sense, I found myself in this horrible position. I was completely naked, having nothing on but my hat and my right boot. A man of the Transport Corps, thinking me dead, had stripped me in the unusual fashion and, wishing to pull off the only boot that remained, was dragging me by one leg with his foot against my body. The jerk which the man gave me no doubt had restored me to my senses. I succeeded in sitting up and spitting out the clots of blood from my throat. The shock caused by the wind of the ball had produced such an extravasation of blood that my face, shoulders, and chest were black, while the rest of my body was stained red by the blood from my wounds. My hat and my hair were full of blood-stained snow, and as I rolled my haggard eyes, I must have been horrible to see. Anyhow, the transport man looked the other way and went off with my property without my being able to say a single word to him, so utterly prostrate was I."
So this guy was horribly wounded in battle, went unconscious. He looked like he was dead. The transport man took his crap and was dragging him? Oh, he was dragging him because he was trying to take off the boot. Okay. And then he woke up. That would be a nightmare. If I did bring myself to be okay with taking some dead body's shoes, I could see that happening if I'm in like those times in that situation. I want to take some boots and then to be pulling a boot off and have the body awaken like a zombie. That would be terrifying. I would have run. But I guess this guy just walked away with his other boot. What are you going to do with one boot?
After being stripped of their belongings, the dead, and occasionally still barely living, would often be buried in mass graves, sometimes with bodies from both sides unceremoniously being thrown in. In general, this was either accomplished via the soldiers themselves doing it, or in many cases, members of the local populace being given the gruesome task. However, there are accounts of battles where thousands of bodies were simply left to the elements. For example, General Philippe Ségur states in 1812, "After passing the Kaloga, we marched on, absorbed in thought, when some of us, raising our eyes, uttered a cry of horror. The ground around us was everywhere covered with fragments of helmets and cuirasses, with broken drums, gun stocks, tatters of uniforms, and standards dyed with blood. On that desolate spot lay 30,000 half-devoured corpses." It should also be noted here that beyond
30,000? That's a lot of dead bodies. That's a lot of boots.
It should also be noted here that beyond any possessions the bodies may have had on them before being stripped, the bodies themselves were also of value. For example, human scavengers would come through and rob the dead of their teeth, which would then be used to make dentures. The Napoleonic Wars and the Battle of Waterloo in particular were such a boon for the British dental industry in this way that dentures for a time were known as Waterloo teeth in the UK. Teeth from soldiers were highly sought after, owing to predominantly coming from relatively young men who still had reasonably good teeth. Oh sir, only let there be a battle, and there'll be no want of teeth. I'll draw them as fast as the men are knocked down.
Waterloo teeth. Oh, that's gross. Look at these old-ass dentures. Waterloo teeth were still appearing in dental supply catalogs of the 1860s, shipped across in barrels from the American Civil War. Gross.
Even more grimly, the bones of the dead of some of these battles were later collected and pulverized into fertilizer, which was sold for a modest price across Europe. Finally, to discuss World War I and World War II, individual units were largely responsible for the disposal of their own dead, with both Axis and Allied forces having their own rules for how this should be handled. As for the Allies during World War II, burying the dead largely fell to individual soldiers, but some units dedicated to the task did exist.
What a nightmare experience. Waking up from being knocked out in a battle and being naked and your body's discolored from blood. It's turned black and you're coughing up blood clots. You're being dragged by one foot. Nightmare. Who was that guy?
Jean-Baptiste Marbeau.
He fought in a lot of battles, so he must have seen a lot of stuff. This must take the cake. Really interesting, grotesque video. Thank y'all for recommending. Thank y'all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Later.